This is Michael Popok with Legal AF with breaking news. We now have new direct evidence of Donald Trump himself interfering with the election process, in this case in the Silver State in Nevada, by making direct phone calls to electors or fake electors to convince them to certify the election in his favor, even after the Nevada Supreme Court had already certified the election properly for Joe Biden, who had won the state by 33,000 votes. This is all revealed in the Jan 6 committee's transcripts that we just got our hands on Wednesday. It is now at least the second example of Donald Trump's active involvement himself, not using buffers, not using those around him, but him picking up the phone and making these phone calls. Where have you heard that before? Because that's also the focus of Fani Willis's investigation and now the Department of Justice in Georgia related to a similar phone call made by Donald Trump and Mark Meadows to the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to try to find 11,700 votes to put him over the top. But this new evidence is Donald Trump making direct phone calls to the GOP head, the Republican Party head in Nevada, and others to try to convince them, at least on December the 4th, to get involved with this illegal, fraudulent, unconstitutional scheme to generate fake elector certificates and send it to the National Archive in Washington and ultimately to Congress as part of their elaborate plot and scheme to overthrow the government and to ensure Donald Trump was president instead of the duly elected Joe Biden. It even gets worse, folks. It turns out, as Forrest Gump once said, stupid is as stupid does. Donald Trump and others around him, including Mark Meadows, Rudy Giuliani, and Eric Trump, made phone calls into Nevada as early as 4 days before the election. Let's repeat that. 4 days before the election even happened, Donald Trump's scheme included calling up people within the state of Nevada to have them start arguing that there was already fraud in the electoral vote before the election had even taken place. This is consistent with the other evidence we know of that Roger Stone and others were creating the big lie about the unreliability, allegedly, of the election system 2 years before the election, which was just picked up by the Trumpers, by the MAGA people, and used before even people went to the polls. Think about that. That is a blood-curdling, chilling observation of testimony obtained by the Jan 6 committee. How do we know this? Because the Jan 6 committee was able to get the testimony of Mike McDonald, who was then the head of the GOP in Nevada, in which they were able to get a deposition under oath of Mr. McDonald. But not surprisingly, Mr. McDonald took the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination 200 times in his testimony with the Jan 6 committee. But they were able to get all of his emails and text messages with Trump and those around Trump, which became part of the analysis of the Jan 6 committee. The Department of Justice now also has this information, as they've already have a grand jury looking into, as part of the multi-pronged approach to the coup, the pressure that Donald Trump placed on elected officials and on local and state officials at the Republican Party level and otherwise to overthrow the election. In fact, the evidence that got developed by the Jan 6 committee, which is now in the hands of Jack Smith, is that Michael McDonald in Nevada also reached out to the Republican Secretary of State of Nevada to try to convince her to certify the election for Donald Trump, even though Biden had beaten him, whipped him by 33,000 votes, and to have her participate officially in the fake elector scandal or scheme. She refused. And what was her reward for being a patriot and doing a job as a Secretary of State? Her party, the Republican Party of Nevada, censured her for not certifying the election for the losing candidate who lost by 33,000 votes, Donald Trump, and not signing off on these fake elector certificates, which had no state seal on them because she was the only one that could put a state seal on them and were not properly certified. she gets censured by the party instead of applauded and celebrated for being a stalwart patriot in the face of a potential coup. As we know now, the Secretary of State position, which people usually give little mind of when they're voting, is supremely important because it is the entity in the state that is responsible for administrating elections and certifying their results. Thank God Katie Hobbs, for instance, was the Secretary of State of Arizona, in the neighboring state of Arizona, when she ran for governor, because at least she could point to all of the proper procedures her own office implemented as Secretary of State against Kari Lake. So that's just an interesting twist there. But again, throwing open the blinds and looking closely at Secretary of State candidates as you make your election decisions is really, really important, especially when they're being pressure tested by these election deniers in the Trump wing of the party, including Trump himself campaigning to deny the credibility of the election days before it even took place. So the timeline that's now been established by the Jan 6 committee, that's now in the hands of the Department of Justice, is relatively straightforward. On October the 28th, days before the election, Trump and others around him, Giuliani, Flynn, his sons, start calling Republican operatives, I'll call them operatives, Republican members of the party in the states of Nevada and other states, to try to convince them that the election has been stolen. An election, I remind you, that has not yet been run yet for another 4 days. Then 2 days after the election, on the 4th of November, Donald Trump himself places a phone call to Michael McDonald, the chairman of the Nevada GOP, to convince him to participate in the false elector certificate scheme and to participate in their war room approach to challenging the election, which is code word for a coup to keep Donald Trump in power against the will of the people. Then the Nevada Supreme Court, the highest court in Nevada, who has the last word on the issue, speaks 4 days later on the or a month later on the 8th of December, so 12/8, and declares Joe Biden appropriately the winner of the Nevada election, finds no fraud, no overwhelming fraud to overcome 33,000 votes in his favor, and declares Biden the winner. 6 days after the Nevada Supreme Court declares Biden the winner, these yahoos, led by Michael McDonald, who are really being manipulated, but willingly, by Donald Trump, meet in Carson City, Nevada, to do their own ceremonial fake elector certificate endorsement event, where they sign and call themselves patriots on their social media feeds, which are now, if you go to them, have been scrubbed of all references to this traitorous event. But at the time, they were calling themselves patriots because they signed, 6 of them signed on the dotted line and then transmitted this fake certificate to the National Archive and ultimately to Congress. Congress and the National Archive rejected them on site, knowing that they were not properly certified by the Secretary of State, did not have the state seal on them, and were irregular in every way. But these idiots, these treasonous idiots, they meet 6 days after their own Supreme Court rules that Joe Biden has won. And notwithstanding that, notwithstanding there's no fraud, they move forward with their elaborate plot and coup. Then when the Secretary of State of Nevada doesn't side with them, and she is a Republican, but she is a patriot and she is a thinking human being, what do? They censure her by the party, basically casting her out and throwing her out of the Republican Party in Nevada, much the way they did with Rusty Bowers, the Speaker of the House in Arizona, who testified very courageously before the Jan 6 committee. So that is the timeline, but it continues into March of 2021 when the Republican Party of Nevada delivers to the Secretary of State what they claim is tens of thousands of examples of fraud. In fact, they tell the Secretary of State that if she looks in these boxes that they've delivered, there's 122,000 examples of voter fraud. Of course, more than enough to overcome Joe Biden's 33,000 vote margin of victory. However, when the Secretary of State looked in the boxes and did her own independent investigation, she found at most 20 voter fraud, people voting twice, people voting in the wrong district, a couple of dead people voting. It does happen. It happens everywhere at every election. But this is 0.00001% of the total vote count and would not overcome a 33,000 vote lead. It wouldn't overcome a 19 vote lead, to hear the Secretary of State tell it. And of course, the Department of Justice is very focused on all of this, as now they should be, with the release of the Jan 6 report. Officially, by operation of law, the Jan 6 committee no longer exists. It's now been completely dissolved, and the Department of Justice needs to continue to pick up the mantelpiece. They're already investigating, as one part of their grand jury process, all of the pressures placed on local and state officials at the Republican Party level, at the precinct level, at the Secretary of State level, in order to try to convince people to commit this fraud on the American people and on the people of their home state. So that is already a focus, and we know that is a continued focus because Michael McDonald, the chairman of the GOP in Nevada, had his phone taken by a search warrant by the Department of Justice, as were the rest of the six members of this treasonous committee that got together to create a fake elector certificate and send it in at the behest of Donald Trump. But not just Donald Trump, the other people who are, based on the evidence developed by the Jan 6 committee and the statements made, who were also involved include, it's the usual suspects, Mark Meadows, and there's a theory that Mark Meadows is now cooperating with the Department of Justice. I have a hot take just on that very point from yesterday. Rudy Giuliani. I mean, is there an underhanded, fraudulent conduct or behavior in any state that doesn't all tie back to Rudy Giuliani? And Eric Trump, who I guess was busy making those phone calls while Don Jr. was busy making phone calls to the other battleground states, and Donald Trump himself. And that is the most important, impactful takeaway from the Jan 6 committee testimony that's now been released, is this direct link, direct line of sight, DNA, fingerprints of Donald Trump on this evidence in a way that we haven't seen before except in Georgia. We know there's been reporting that Donald Trump made similar phone calls in Colorado, made similar phone calls in Michigan, but this is the first example that we have of Donald Trump stepping out from behind, the coward that he is, his lawyers and others at various levels, and doing the dirty work himself. Why does that matter? Because now we're talking about criminal prosecution. And in order for Jack Smith and his band of happy warrior DOJ prosecutors to be successful, they've got to prove what we call in the business mens rea, which is just a fancy way of saying criminal mind or criminal intent. And in order to show criminal mind or criminal intent, you've got to show conduct and behavior that allows the jury to get inside the mind, crack it open, with a can opener, the mind of the criminal defendant. And the way that they're judged, because except in rare circumstances when somebody allows themselves to be tape recorded muttering that they committed the crime, which has also happened, you have to prove it by circumstantial evidence and conduct in letters, in phone calls, in writings, in video that indicate a guilty mind. This is another piece of evidence now that the Department of Justice has in place to go against Donald Trump to make their prosecution airtight. If they're going to go after Donald Trump, just the way the Department of Justice is bringing all of their forces to bear and bringing in thousands and thousands of hours of investigative research and evidence to convict each of the lower level Jan 6 defendants, like just this past week with defendant Gillespie, they have to do even a greater amount of work and due diligence to square off every circle, to dot every I, to cross every T, and to make their case against Donald Trump airtight and waterproof. This is the beginning of evidence directly linking Donald Trump to the crimes that he will ultimately be charged over. This is Michael Popok reporting for Legal AF on the link between Donald Trump and the pressure on the Nevada GOP and Secretary of State to overthrow the will of the people of Nevada and give the election in a coup to Donald Trump.
MeidasTouch is unapologetically pro-democracy. And look, we know you are too. So please make sure you check out our best-selling shirt and our best-selling gear, the unapologetically pro-democracy gear. And hey, while you're at it, make sure you check out my favorite shirt and one of our most famous designs. It wasn't rigged, you're just a loser. At store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.